There are disasters you can see: fire, flood, famine. But once, the world faced a different kind of ending. A morning that never came, a sun that refused to rise, and for 15 years, humanity lived beneath a dying sky. No one remembered when the light began to fade. Some said it happened in spring, when the first blossoms were still on the branches. Others swore it began in summer, when the sun should have burned gold above the fields but instead hung pale and distant, like the ghost of a dying star. All that anyone could agree on was that one morning, the day simply failed to arrive. At first, it was only strange. The light dimmer than usual, the air colder, the sky a dull grey that swallowed the horizon. But soon, fear began to move through the villages and cities like a slow contagion. The shadows grew long even at noon. The birds fell silent. Farmers stood in their fields, staring upward at a sun that glowed like a candle behind smoked glass. In Constantinople, scholars debated omens and eclipses. In Ireland, monks scratched words into damp parchment, noting how the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year. In China, court astrologers warned the emperor that heaven itself had turned against the realm. The earth had gone dim, and no one could say why. The world seemed trapped between night and day, a permanent twilight that neither advanced nor retreated. Children asked their parents what crime had angered the heavens. Old men whispered that the final judgment had come at last. When light dies, so too does certainty. Across the continents, the air thickened with a fine, silvery dust. The wind carried it into homes, across rivers, over cities and temples. It settled on water, dulling reflections. It coated the leaves until they gleamed grey instead of green. Some said it was ash. Others called it divine punishment. But those who breathed it in knew it as a taste of metal and rot, the breath of a sickened earth. The cold arrived next. Not the clean cold of winter, but something deeper, a chill that felt unnatural, as though the sun's warmth had been stolen. Summer failed to bloom. Frost crawled across the edges of lakes. The soil grew hard and lifeless. Fields of barley and wheat browned and blackened under a sun that gave no heat. In northern lands, the herds began to die first. In the south, rivers thinned, and the seas darkened under the shadowed sky. For the first time in memory, famine visited the world not as a local misfortune, but as a universal truth. No border, no empire, no faith could keep the darkness at bay. From the Byzantine capital to the cold coasts of Scandinavia, priests held vigils. Some burned incense and prayed for mercy. Others performed old rites in secret, calling upon forgotten gods of light and harvest. The new faiths and the old met beneath the same failing sun, united in dread. Travelers spoke of strange sights: halos around the moon, red auroras rippling at the edge of the horizon, stars that flickered in daylight like watchful eyes. Fishermen said the sea no longer reflected the heavens, only the color of lead. The world's rhythm, the eternal dance of day and night, had been broken. Time itself felt uncertain, and then came the silence. Animals fled the forests. The hum of insects vanished. Even the wind seemed to lose its voice. Villages became islands of sound in a sea of stillness. People began to believe that creation itself was unraveling. Mothers covered their children's eyes when the noonday sun rose dim and small, afraid that looking too long might call death closer. For centuries, the sun had been a symbol of order, the great heart of heaven, constant and unchanging. Its fading was more than a natural disaster, it was an existential wound. If the sun could vanish, what else could be trusted? In Rome's fading libraries, scholars searched the old texts for meaning, stories of eclipses, floods, and fires that had darkened the skies before. In the East, the chroniclers of the Liang dynasty wrote of yellow dust that darkened the day, and of crops that failed for years afterward. In the icy lands beyond the Baltic, skalds composed verses about the wolf that swallows the sun, a myth that, for the first time, felt like prophecy. But myths cannot feed the hungry. Within months, the harvests began to fail. Fruit withered on the branches. Grain heads remained empty. Even the grass lost its color, turning pale as parchment. Smoke rose from the fields where desperate farmers burned their dead crops, praying that cleansing fire might restore the soil. The year 536 became a whisper passed between travelers, the year the sun disappeared. In some places, snow fell in midsummer. In others, frost clung to the wheat, even as the calendar promised warmth. It was as if the earth had been tilted away from life itself. Yet amid the terror, there was awe, the kind of awe that only comes when humanity is reminded of its smallness. Poets wrote of the sky's strange glow, a silver haze that never lifted, a beauty born of catastrophe. Sailors said that at sea, the horizon dissolved into nothingness, and it felt as though one could fall forever into the grey. In monasteries and royal courts alike, people began to see omens in everything: the cry of a raven, the tremor of the earth, the pattern of clouds above the blackened sun. The world had become a message, one written in smoke and silence, and every man sought to read it, but no answer came. The silence stretched across continents, across months, until it began to feel eternal. And in that silence, something shifted in the human heart. The arrogance of empire, the comfort of routine, the illusion of permanence all began to erode. The darkness outside became the darkness within. Still, life persisted. Fires were lit. Bread was baked from whatever remained. Children were born beneath the pale sky, their first sight of the world a dim, colorless light. Hope became smaller, quieter, but it did not die. Humanity waited, as it always does, for the sun to return. And as the seasons turned, and the shadows refused to lift, a new kind of faith began to form. Some looked to the heavens for redemption. Others turned inward, searching for meaning in endurance itself. The world was changing not just in climate, but in spirit. For when the sky goes dark, the soul begins to see itself. The year 536 was not only a year of shadow, but of revelation, a reminder that all human certainty depends on a single, fragile light, and that light had gone out. Yet even as despair spread, the earth was not finished. Far below the clouds, in the depths of oceans and mountains, the forces that had blotted out the sun were still at work. The world was shifting, the old age ending, a new one beginning, born in ash and silence. For this was not the end of days, but the beginning of something darker, colder, and far more enduring. The first year of darkness had taken the world by surprise. The second began to take it apart. By 537 AD, the grey veil had not lifted. The light that filtered through the clouds was thin and cruel, a sun stripped of warmth. The seasons had collapsed into one another, blending frost with rain, hunger with fear. The earth had forgotten its rhythm. In the farms of Gaul, peasants dug at frozen soil with bare hands, hoping for roots that no longer grew. In the mountains of Anatolia, herders watched their flocks vanish to hunger and cold. Across the northern forests, travelers found the bones of villages, places abandoned when food ran out. The chronicles of the time read like lamentations. Cassiodorus, a Roman official, wrote that, "We marvel to see no shadows of our bodies at noon." In the east, the Emperor Justinian's scribes recorded failed harvests and dying provinces. The empire that had once claimed eternity was starving. But the cold did not come alone. Famine opened the door for its darker companion, plague. In the years following the vanished sun, disease swept through the weakened world. Bodies thinned by hunger became prey to fevers. In Egypt, where the Nile's floods once guaranteed abundance, pestilence rode the grain ships northward to Constantinople, to Italy, to every port that still dared to trade. The living buried the dead until there was no one left to dig. By 541, the first great pandemic in recorded history had begun, the plague of Justinian. It would kill tens of millions and alter the course of civilization, but its roots lay here, in the long winter that had weakened the flesh and faith of humankind. Historians now trace this chain of suffering to a world hidden beneath the clouds. Somewhere, perhaps in Iceland, perhaps in the tropics, a volcano had torn itself apart, hurling its heart into the sky. The sulfur and ash spread like a veil around the planet, scattering sunlight, poisoning the air. It was an invisible empire of dust, ruling over kings and peasants alike. But the people of the 6th century did not know this. They saw no eruption, heard no thunder, only the aftermath. A world dimmed, a god silent, a son in exile. And so they turned to faith and fear. In Rome, priests marched barefoot through the streets, carrying icons and chanting prayers to ward off divine wrath. In Scandinavia, the sagas tell of endless winter, Fimbulvetter, that would precede the twilight of the gods. The myth and the moment became one. The monks of Ireland recorded visions of angels weeping blood. In Syria, preachers warned that the horsemen of Revelation had begun to ride. In China, the emperor's astrologers declared that the mandate of heaven had been withdrawn. Even the Maya, far across the oceans, spoke of darkened suns and divine punishment. The world had become a single congregation beneath a dying sky. Yet amid the fear, the machinery of survival turned on. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian ordered grain imports from Egypt, a desperate gamble to feed a starving capital. Caravan routes shifted southward, chasing sunlight. Fishermen sailed farther from shore, seeking food in a sea that seemed to grow colder by the day. But the oceans were strange now. Their currents had changed, their fish died or vanished into the depths. Sailors returned with haunted eyes, whispering that the sea itself had turned against them. In the north, the cold carved deeper wounds. Ice crept down from the Arctic, swallowing pastures and forests. Livestock froze in the fields. In Scandinavia, archaeological layers show entire settlements abandoned between 536 and 550, people walking away from their homes to chase a warmer horizon. Some never found one. The silence of the sun became a silence of civilization. Markets emptied. Roads fell into disrepair. Armies disbanded for lack of food. Even time seemed to fracture. The rhythm of harvest and festival broken beyond repair. And yet, in this desolation, the seeds of transformation took root. The collapse of the old Roman world, its roads, its trade, its imperial certainty, gave rise to something new. In the ashes of order, the medieval world began to form. Faith, once the domain of scholars and priests, became the lifeline of the common man. Churches filled with the starving, praying not for salvation in the next world, but for sunlight in this one. Out of desperation, a new intensity of belief emerged. Fervent, mystical, apocalyptic. In the east, Justinian built the Hagia Sophia, a monument to light in a world without it. Its dome caught what little sun remained, transforming it into gold. To those who entered, it felt like stepping into heaven itself, an act of defiance against the dying world. But even the emperor could not command the sky. His wars against the Goths and Vandals drained the empire's strength. His cities starved, his people buried their dead by torchlight. For all his power, Justinian ruled an empire of shadow. In the far north, legends began to speak of gods and giants locked in battle, their fury turning the sky to ash. In these stories, humanity was not merely a victim of fate, but a witness to the cosmic struggle between light and dark. Such myths gave meaning to the meaningless, a way to survive the unexplainable. Still, the world kept breaking. The summers of 537, 538, and 539 were all cold. Frost clung to fields even in July. Trees stopped bearing fruit. The price of grain rose until it could no longer be measured. In China, the chronicles tell of snow in summer and famine for 3 years. In Europe, bones unearthed from the time show signs of malnutrition, lines of hunger carved into the very bodies of the living. The volcanic dust high in the stratosphere reflected sunlight away, chilling the planet by several degrees, enough to tilt life toward extinction, and humanity, scattered and unprepared, was left to endure. In monasteries and marketplaces alike, people began to whisper that this was not the work of nature, but of destiny. Perhaps the world was being purified, perhaps it was being punished, or perhaps, they said, it was dying. The world had become a lesson in fragility. Empires could fall not by sword or fire, but by the dimming of a star, and those who survived learned to see themselves not as masters of creation, but as guests in a house that could go dark without warning. By the end of the decade, when faint warmth finally began to return, few dared to trust it. The memory of endless dusk had branded itself into the human soul. Even the sunlight felt different now, brittle, hesitant, like a wounded thing. But something else had also changed, something invisible, yet irreversible. The long darkness had not only starved the body, it had transformed the mind. Across continents, humanity had looked into the void and found faith, in gods, in destiny, in endurance itself. Out of hunger was born humility, out of ruin, reverence, and though the sun would one day return, the world that awaited it would never be the same, because in the cold and the silence, a new age had begun, one shaped not by conquest or empire, but by fear, faith, and the search for meaning in an uncaring universe. And in that searching, humanity had begun to change. For when the world forgets the warmth of the sun, it starts to seek the fire within. But even as the survivors lifted their eyes to a pale, returning light, another shadow waited on the horizon, one not born of ash or frost, but of the human heart itself. When the world loses the sun, it does not simply lose light, it loses certainty, rhythm, and meaning. In the years that followed the volcanic winter, humanity's hunger was no longer only of the body, it was of the soul. For when crops fail and kings fall silent, the mind turns to the unseen. People began to seek explanations not from the earth, but from the heavens. Every whisper of thunder, every flicker of lightning became a message from something greater, or something darker. In the smoke-filled monasteries of Europe, monks wrote by candlelight, their quills scratching against parchment that trembled with every cold gust. They recorded the end of days, as though it had already come. To them, the darkness was divine punishment, a correction sent by God to humble a sinful world. Sermons spoke of revelation, of trumpets and horsemen, of stars falling from the sky, and for those who had seen the sun dim to a dying ember, it did not feel like metaphor. Villagers gathered in churches not out of devotion, but desperation. They prayed through the long grey days and longer nights, waiting for signs of forgiveness. When no miracle came, some turned against one another. Accusations of witchcraft, of hidden sins and secret blasphemies, spread like sparks in dry straw. The absence of light had made the human heart flammable. Across the mountains and seas, the same story unfolded in 1,000 tongues. In the Byzantine Empire, bishops urged repentance while plague still carried off their flocks. In Egypt, the Coptic faithful processed barefoot through the sand, chanting prayers older than empire. In China, where the emperor's astronomers had charted heaven's every movement, the sky itself now defied prediction. The records speak of red suns, phantom moons, and lights that moved against the constellations, signs that heaven's balance had broken. People began to speak of a mandate withdrawn. The ruler was no longer blessed. The world had slipped from harmony into chaos. Farmers turned from the bureaucracy of the state to the intimacy of the gods, gods of rivers, mountains, and ancestors. Faith contracted and deepened, becoming personal, trembling, raw. In the icy north, the Norse watched as their world darkened, and their myths came alive. They had always believed in Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods when the sun would be swallowed by wolves and the earth frozen beyond repair. Now, it seemed to be happening before their eyes. The poets sang of a sky without color and a sea that steamed with poison. The myths that once offered comfort now felt like memory. But darkness has a way of shaping the imagination as much as it does faith. Artists, monks, and storytellers began to give form to the fear. In frescoes, demons crept closer to earth. In illuminated manuscripts, Christ's halo burned brighter against the gloom. Light and shadow became not opposites, but adversaries, each struggling for dominion over the human heart. Out of this conflict came transformation. Religion was no longer the quiet language of tradition. It became a storm of belief, a fevered cry for order in a universe that seemed indifferent. Prophets arose from dust and hunger, claiming visions of angels, omens, and divine instruction. Some gathered followers who wandered from village to village, proclaiming that the end had already begun, and that repentance was the only shelter left. Others found solace in isolation. Hermits fled into caves and mountains, believing solitude was purity, that silence itself was the only prayer worth uttering. From these wanderers, monastic movements grew. The darkness had made the world hostile, but within stone walls, a new kind of peace could be born. Monasteries became islands of light, repositories of books, of bread, of hope. And yet, even within these sanctuaries, doubt festered. For every soul that found faith, another found despair. Many began to wonder, if God had turned his face away, perhaps he was no longer there at all. A quiet heresy began to bloom in whispers, that perhaps the end of the world was not divine wrath, but nature itself, cold and uncaring. The first hints of a future thought, the question that would one day divide faith and reason, stirred in the shadows of famine. Still, the instinct to believe proved stronger than the will to doubt. Humanity's need for meaning, sharpened by suffering, began to build new mythologies. In Europe, relics of saints were said to glow faintly in the dark, proof that light still lived in holy things. In the East, legends spoke of dragons and divine fires beneath the mountains, echoes perhaps of the very volcanoes that had blotted out the sun. The darkness had become sacred. It was no longer merely an absence of light, but a stage upon which humanity's fears and hopes could play. In Constantinople, when the plague finally loosened its grip, survivors filled the Hagia Sophia once more. Its great dome caught the morning light, pale, hesitant, but real. To those gathered beneath it, this was proof that the divine had not abandoned them. The empire proclaimed renewal. Priests called it resurrection, but the scars ran deeper than faith could heal. The loss of so many, the countless graves dug into frozen earth, left a silence that religion alone could not fill. People began to measure life differently, not by wealth or status but by endurance. Survival itself became sacred, and in that new reverence for endurance, humanity began to change. Communities rebuilt smaller, tighter, more self-reliant. The great cities shrank, villages thrived in isolation. Faith shifted from the grandeur of empire to the intimacy of the hearth. A mother's prayer over a child's thin frame became as holy as the chant of 1,000 monks. Yet in the collective imagination, the shadow remained. The world had seen what it looked like when light faltered. Every eclipse, every storm, every failed harvest would now echo that memory. The myth of apocalypse had entered the bloodstream of civilization. From it would spring centuries of prophecy and fear, of doomsday predictions, celestial portents, and millenarian movements that would shape kingdoms and crusades. The volcanic winter of 536 was no longer just an event. It had become a mirror, reflecting the deepest truth of the human condition, that faith is born not in light, but in darkness. Still, beneath the surface of belief, another kind of power was awakening, quieter, colder, and far less forgiving. The darkness had not only driven people to prayer, it had taught rulers the value of control. When fear became currency, power found new ways to spend it. In the decades to come, kings and popes would learn how to wield the apocalypse as a weapon, to command through prophecy, to rule through salvation. The line between faith and authority would blur until it became indistinguishable. But for now, in the fragile dawn of recovery, the world stood trembling, half in shadow, half in light, unsure which it truly belonged to, because the sun had begun to return, but its warmth had not. The fields were green again, but haunted, the churches full but desperate. Humanity had survived the long night, yet it was no longer the same species that entered it, for in learning to worship light, it had learned to fear the dark within, and far to the north, deep beneath the glaciers, another volcano stirred. Its heartbeat was slow, patient, a reminder that the gods of ash were not finished with the earth just yet. The dawn may have returned, but the shadow had only learned to wait. At first, no one believed it. After so many years of grey mornings and twilight noons, of pale suns that gave no warmth, the idea of true light felt like blasphemy. Yet one spring around the year 550, the sky began to clear. Slowly, almost shyly, blue began to seep back into the world. The sun returned, not with triumph, but with fragility. Its light fell across fields that had forgotten how to bloom, across faces lined by famine and fear. The people stood in their doorways and stared upward, blinking, unsure whether to weep or kneel. It had been 15 years since the world had known the fullness of daylight. In that moment, humanity realized something profound, that survival had cost them more than they understood. The old world, the world of Rome's golden roads and empires that promised eternity, was gone. The volcanic winter had erased it, not with fire and conquest, but with silence. The Byzantine Empire still stood, but hollowed, its wealth drained by plague, its cities half empty. In the west, kingdoms had fractured into petty realms. What remained of Rome was a memory, fading like smoke, but in the ashes of empire something new began to stir. The early pulse of the medieval world. When the sun returned, it did not restore the past, it revealed what had changed. Faith, once centralized in towering institutions, now flowed like underground water through small communities. Monks in Ireland copied holy texts by flickering candlelight. Farmers rebuilt villages around churches, which had become both sanctuaries and storehouses. The human world had turned inward, more humble, more devout, but also more resilient. In Constantinople, the survivors spoke of the miracle of light. To them, the return of the sun was not merely nature's recovery, it was divine forgiveness. Justinian's rebuilt capital gleamed once more, crowned by the great dome of Hagia Sophia, its golden mosaics blazing in the renewed daylight. For a moment, it seemed the empire might be reborn, but history never repeats. It only echoes. The sun's return revealed a different planet, colder, harsher, subtly altered. The air carried less warmth. The harvests never quite regained their former strength. The volcanic winter had nudged the climate toward a century of instability. Rivers changed course. Forests shifted north. People migrated in slow, desperate waves, searching for land that would yield again. In Scandinavia, the collapse of old kingdoms after 536 gave birth to new ones, forged by those who survived the famine. The sagas would later speak of a generation that lived through the years of the wolf, a phrase that meant both hunger and endurance. From that crucible emerged the ancestors of the Vikings, a people shaped by scarcity and sea, who would one day sail into history's light. In the East, China's dynasties reeled under the weight of failed harvests and rebellion. Yet from the chaos, innovation emerged, new agricultural techniques, new philosophies of endurance. The Confucian idea of harmony with nature deepened, no longer a theory but a necessity. Humanity had been reminded of its smallness in the cosmic order, and across Europe, the lingering fear of darkness never truly faded. Every eclipse, every long winter, every blood-red sunset was interpreted as a warning, a whisper from that lost decade when the sun had vanished. The apocalypse had left its fingerprint on the collective mind. Art began to reflect it. In the illuminated manuscripts of monks, demons crouched at the corners of every page, their forms half buried in ink and gold. Churches were built with thick walls and narrow windows, fortresses against both night and despair. The imagery of the Last Judgment, fire, angels, stars falling from the sky, became central to the medieval imagination. It was as though the world could no longer separate faith from fear, or salvation from catastrophe. The volcanic winter had bound them together forever, but the return of light also awakened something else: curiosity. For the first time, people began to question not just why the sky had darkened, but how. Scholars and priests debated whether it had been a sign from God or a phenomenon of nature. The seeds of inquiry, faint, fragile, were sown in that soil of superstition. In the centuries that followed, those seeds would grow into the early sciences of the medieval and Renaissance worlds. Astronomy, meteorology, and the study of natural philosophy all carried within them a trace of that ancient dread, the memory of a world that had once gone blind. But in the 6th century, such understanding was still far away. For now, the people were content simply to feel the warmth of the sun again, even if it was a weaker sun than before. Children born after the darkness thought their parents' stories were exaggerations, legends told to keep them obedient. Yet the elders remembered. They remembered how the air had tasted of ash, how frost had grown on summer fields, how the moon had burned red over silent cities. The year 536 had become a scar that could not be erased, a wound in time, visible only in memory. And as generations passed, the story transformed. It became myth, then scripture, then warning. Each culture kept its own version. The Norse spoke of the Fimbulwinter that would precede Ragnarok. The Christians told of Revelation's tribulations before the final dawn. The Chinese recalled a heavenly veil that covered the earth, a punishment for imbalance between man and nature. It was no longer a single event in history. It had become part of humanity's spiritual DNA, the idea that the world could end, not with fire or flood, but with the quiet theft of light. And though the sun now shone again, its return carried a lesson: light is not guaranteed. Civilization, faith, and memory all depend on it. And when it falters, everything else trembles. Centuries later, scientists would uncover the truth. Layers of ice and tree rings, revealing the signatures of colossal eruptions, perhaps from Iceland or El Salvador, that had cast the earth into shadow. They would give the event a name, the Late Antique Little Ice Age. But names could not capture what it had meant to those who lived through it. For them, it was not a climate event, it was a reckoning. And in a way, it still is. Even now, the echoes of that age linger. The myths of apocalypse, the obsession with the end of days, the instinct to link catastrophe with sin, all trace their roots to those dim years when the sun disappeared. Humanity's imagination was forged in that darkness. Our religions, our fears, our longing for meaning in suffering, all grew from that moment when we stood beneath a dying sky and asked why. But there is another echo, quieter and more hopeful. The fact that we survived, that after years of hunger, cold, and despair, people still planted seeds in frozen ground, still prayed, still believed that light would return, even when all evidence said it would not. That faith, irrational and relentless, is the thread that runs through all of history. The faith that tomorrow will rise brighter than today. As the 6th century drew to its uneasy close, humanity began to rebuild, one field, one church, one story at a time. The Middle Ages were dawning. The memory of the lost sun faded, but its shadow remained behind every prayer and every fear, because deep down, every civilization knows how thin the veil truly is, how easily the light can be taken away. And though the sky had finally cleared, one truth had been carved into the soul of mankind. The sun may return, but the darkness never truly leaves. The story of 536 was over, yet its shadow would fall across every century that followed, because somewhere deep in the heart of the earth, the fire that once darkened the world still breathes, waiting. The year the sun disappeared tells the haunting true story of 536 AD, the year historians now call the worst year to be alive. A mysterious volcanic eruption shrouded the earth in darkness, plunging the world into cold, famine, and fear. Empires faltered, faith transformed, and the myth of apocalypse was reborn. For 15 years, humanity lived beneath a dimmed sky, and when the light finally returned, it found a changed world. The volcanic winter had erased the age of Rome and birthed the medieval dawn. Out of ash and silence rose a new kind of humanity, humbled, devout, and forever aware that civilization itself hangs by the thread of sunlight. This is not just a story of climate and catastrophe, it is the story of how darkness reshaped the human soul. If this story moved you, if the thought of the sky darkening over a frightened world stirred something ancient inside you, then don't let the light fade here. Like this video to help more viewers discover the forgotten history of the year the sun disappeared. Subscribe for more cinematic explorations of moments when the earth, the heavens, and the human heart collided, when myth and reality became indistinguishable. Your voice shapes the next story we tell. Comment below and tell us what moment in history should we bring to life next. Do you want to journey into the year without a summer in 1816, when volcanoes again dimmed the sun, or explore the Black Death that followed in the wake of this same volcanic age? Comment your idea. The past still burns. Help us decide which shadow we'll step into next.